One of the major issues facing the Japanese church right now is that many Japanese churches are literally dying out. Now that sounds dire, but this is very closely related to the demographic crisis that Japan has been facing for many decades now. Put simply, the birth rate has been unsustainable in Japan for a long time, and the result is that there are more Japanese dying every year than there are being born, which results in a population decline. And this is having a major impact on many Japanese churches. We're seeing basically the same effect where essentially there are more church members who are dying or leaving the church every year than there are new believers that are being baptized and brought into the church each year. And as a result, the Japanese Christian church population is declining, but the decline here is actually steeper than the decline of the general population. Now, this video is actually part 3 in a series where I've been talking through some of the issues facing the Japanese church. In part 2, I talked about why I think some of this decline is happening. But in this video, I want to talk about some of the things that can be done to address this issue. Is there anything we can do to fix it? And I want to look at this problem from 2 angles. One is from the perspective of what can Japanese churches do to address this issue, and the other is what can the international Christian community do to help in this area. But before we jump into that, let me try and flesh out a little bit what this actually looks like in day-to-day life in Japanese churches. If you've stumbled across this channel for the first time, my name is Dave Robison, and I am a missionary church planter working in rural Japan. For the past 13 years, my wife and I, along with our kids, have been living and working in rural Japan, and we are partnering with Japanese churches currently doing church planting. So I'm serving in Iwate Prefecture, and we are working in partnership with the Japanese Conservative Baptist Church Association. And in our Iwate Rengo, our group of churches in our area, there are 5 churches, 6 if you count our church plant. And in addition to that, we cooperate with a number of other Japanese churches and church plants that are in the area. Now, Iwate is a rural prefecture in Japan, so I've gotten to see firsthand how some of these demographic issues come into play. One of the biggest challenges is a severe shortage of pastors in Japan. So out of the 5 churches that we work closely with, 2 of them have been without a pastor for more than 10 years. But by God's grace, just this year, one of them was able to call a new pastor. So we're really praising God for that. But this is a real challenge that many Japanese churches face. I recently went to a seminary graduation of a friend, and there were only 4 students who were graduating that year. And I ran into another pastor who had graduated from the same seminary that I knew, and I talked to him a bit. He mentioned that when he graduated around 20 years ago, there were something like 20 students graduating each year to go into pastoral ministry. And so the situation that we see right now is that the average age of pastors in Japan is getting older and older every year, in large part because many of these pastors feel like they can't retire because there aren't new pastors to come and pastor their congregations after they retire. So I think the average age of a pastor in Japan is something like 70 years old now. The other side of this is that the average size of Japanese churches has always been small. It's not uncommon to have a church with 10 members or even less than 10 members. But since the church population is declining, you're having members that are getting older and there aren't new believers that are coming into the churches. And so that means that many churches have a population of older people with no young people coming in behind them. And so church sizes are slowly shrinking. And so this situation is particularly difficult in rural places like Iwate because rural Japan is very mountainous and cities are very spread out. And so you have many of these very small, isolated populations of Christians that are getting older and shrinking, which makes it even more difficult for them to have a pastor come and serve at their church. And this is a real issue because something like 30% of the Japanese population lives outside of the large cities. And if a church dies out in one of these small cities, it might be the only gospel witness that that city has. So what can be done to address these challenges? Well, like I said earlier, I want to look at this from 2 angles, one being from what can Japanese churches do, and the second being what can the international Christian community do. So let's start by talking about some of the things that I think the Japanese church can do to help address these issues. And again, I want to emphasize that I'm coming at this from the perspective of someone who's involved in church planting. So these are things that I need to think about as I'm trying to start a new church in a rural place in Japan, because these are issues that are directly facing us. I've also had the privilege of working alongside other Japanese pastors who are facing these same issues, so I can share some of the things that they're doing as well. So right now, one of the most common things that's happening is that pastors are taking on responsibilities for multiple churches. Now, in the long run, this isn't sustainable. Japanese pastors are typically very overworked themselves to take care of a single congregation. So to have 1 or 2 other congregations that might be an hour or so drive away from their main congregation. But this is typically how the pastorless church situation has been addressed. But recently, there's been some interesting developments, particularly in our mother church that we work very closely with, that I think helps to address these problems in a more sustainable way. So our mother church is a larger church that I believe has somewhere around 70 to 80 members, which makes it pretty big for a Japanese church. And they're supporting our church plant on the coast, which is about an hour and a half away from them. And they also have another small congregation up in the mountains, kind of opposite from us, which is another hour and a half or 2 hours away from where they are. Comparatively speaking, both our congregation on the coast and the one up in the mountains is very small. Neither would be able to support a full-time pastor on their own. So one thing that our mother church does is that they offer their services online so that occasionally we connect to them via Zoom. The one in the mountains connects very frequently, and then that way we're able to sort of digitally fellowship with our mother church, even though they're pretty far away from us. Another really encouraging development is that our mother church was recently able to call a second pastor. But one of the main reasons that they decided to do this was to support other churches in the area like ours and the one in the mountains. So they felt the need to create something of a ministry team at their church that could be a blessing to other churches that have needs in the area. And so I think it's really encouraging to see larger churches like that try and find creative ways to help address the challenges that the smaller churches and the pastorless churches in the area are facing. A second thing that I think needs to happen is that the barriers between churches and denominations needs to be broken down. There are situations where you have multiple very small congregations in the same city. Maybe one has a pastor, one doesn't. And unfortunately, it seems like oftentimes the members of one Japanese church don't interact very much with members of a different church. This is particularly true if they're from different denominations. And that lack of relationship between Christians in different churches is something that makes it very difficult for those churches to consider possibly combining or joining together for fellowship and encouragement in this very isolating situation. But this is another area where we've seen some progress, particularly in the area that we're working in. As many of you know, Iwate Prefecture was hit by the tsunami back in 2011, and one of the results from that is that many of the churches in the area started working together to do disaster relief, whereas previously they didn't have that close of a relationship. And in fact, there was a disaster relief church network that was formed out of that called the 311 Church Network, and that was interdenominational, interchurch, and so you had churches working together to meet the humanitarian needs of the 2011 earthquake and disaster. But after the tsunami relief was over, there were many churches that felt the need for church planting. And so the network that was started to support disaster relief has now continued, is now supporting church planting efforts that are happening in multiple denominations in different cities. And so our church plant has been able to build a lot of great relationships with the other church plants on the coast and even other churches that are inland, not necessarily from our own denomination. Generally in Japan, relationships like this take a long time to develop, so this isn't the kind of thing that would happen overnight, but over the last 15 years, it's kind of developed organically, and it's really been wonderful to see. And it's the kind of thing that I hope more Japanese churches in other parts of Japan get to experience. Another thing that I think can help this issue is the training and development of lay leaders within churches. And this is something that, again, is not typically common among Japanese churches. The more common model is for each church to have one seminary-trained church leader, the pastor, and he does most of the ministry work. The things like leading Bible studies and prayer meetings and preaching on Sunday and managing the day-to-day business of the church. And he'll get support from lay people in a lot of the administrative functions, but most of the spiritual roles fall on that single pastor. And so when you have a church that doesn't have a pastor, they really struggle because they don't have anyone in the church who's really been discipled to take on the role of a spiritual leader within the church like that. And that's one thing that we really hope to see happen within our church plant is as we grow and get new believers, we want to be discipling and raising up lay people in the church to serve in a spiritual capacity, so that in the future, Lord willing, if this church grows to the point where we can call a full-time Japanese pastor to take it over, they'll be well supported by other members within the church and perhaps even be equipped to reach some of the remote villages around our town. By the same token, if there's some way to train up lay leaders within these churches that don't have pastors to help fill that role until they can call a pastor and then continue to fill that role when a pastor comes in supporting the pastor, I really feel like that could be a huge benefit to the churches here in Japan. Finally, the most obvious and biggest need that there is for evangelism, discipleship, and leadership training to be done within the churches. Churches need to be involved in reaching out to their communities and sharing the gospel. People need to hear it, to be saved and baptized and brought into the church. They need to be discipled and trained and raised up and sent out. This is kind of the basic model for how churches grow and reproduce. And yet this is a huge challenge because so many of the churches are just fighting for survival at this point. But somehow churches in Japan need to maintain that heart for evangelism, discipleship, and leadership training, even in the midst of this crisis. And as difficult as that is, I've been really encouraged to see many Japanese pastors and churches really take this to heart and still finding ways to be active in evangelism and discipleship. And I think that's a good segue for moving on to the second angle I want to consider this problem from, and that is, what can the international Christian community do to help with this? Because I think the missions community here in Japan is primarily focused on that last one, the idea of evangelism, discipleship, and leadership training. And I definitely see most missionaries in Japan working in these areas. And that's great. Again, this is one of the things that we need the most to happen here in Japan. We need people sharing the gospel and discipling new believers and training up leaders. Where I think there can be an improvement is that it seems like the Japanese missions community and the Japanese church are primarily doing these things independently of one another. Another way you could frame this is that it seems like the church in Japan is facing a crisis or a battle on two fronts. On the one hand, you have the battle to raise up the next generation of Japanese Christians and leaders. And on the other front, you have the battle for the survival of the existing Japanese churches that are struggling under this demographic crisis. And while the Japanese church is doing what they can to try and tackle both of these challenges simultaneously, it seems like the international missions community is almost exclusively focused on the next generation issue of raising up believers and disciples, while leaving the Japanese churches largely to themselves to tackle the issue of survival. And I get that tension. When I came over as a new missionary, that was the perspective that I had as well, that the missions community, that our job was to be involved in evangelism and discipleship and leadership training and church planting. And that's still very much true. But I get the sense that sometimes the Japanese churches and pastors feel like they're being left to fend for themselves while the missions community has so many resources that they're largely using for their own initiatives. And my hope isn't that missionaries stop working in evangelism and discipleship and go over and start helping in revitalizing Japanese churches. My hope is that there can be more cooperation between the international missions community and the Japanese church community, and that missionaries might find ways to show solidarity and support and love to these Japanese churches by helping them in this demographic crisis, while also making them more effective in discipleship, evangelism, and church planting. And recently, we've been seeing some really encouraging signs that this is beginning to happen. At least in the area of Japan that we're working in, we are seeing greater cooperation between missionaries and Japanese churches, and we're just seeing some really wonderful relationships and partnerships develop. And again, this is the kind of thing I want to see happen more and more throughout Japan. So here's some ways I think the international missions community can begin to get more involved in that. The biggest need is for long-term missionaries to go and partner with these Japanese churches, specifically missionaries who are able to learn the Japanese language. And this is particularly crucial when you're talking about rural places, because there are many churches that don't have many English speakers. And if you can't speak Japanese, it's very difficult for them to receive you and to work alongside you because they can't communicate with you. And good communication is something that is highly valued in Japanese society. So if a pastor feels like they can't communicate well with a missionary in English, they'll be highly unlikely to be able to really have an effective working relationship with them or to want to go in that direction. And these relationships often take a long time to develop, which is why there's a particular need for long-term missionaries who can come and spend many years working among these Japanese church communities. Let me give you an example of how that worked with us, because this wasn't something we planned, but it's something that we really kind of fell into, and we've really been just so grateful at the way that God has allowed these relationships to develop. So our original plan was to go to Tokyo and do church planting, working within the missions community, but we always had the heart to partner with Japanese churches. But when the tsunami hit in 2011, we decided to come up to Iwate Prefecture instead, because we had a relationship with the pastor of the mother church that we're working with now. And we saw that all of this work was happening in relief work, and we had this sense that perhaps through the Christian relief work that was happening, God might open the doors for church planting later on. So we went to Iwate Prefecture. We went to a rural part of Japan, but we didn't have any firm ministry, plan or framework for doing church planting. We kind of just went and showed up and, tried to see where we could help out. And in fact, we couldn't really help out with much at first because I didn't speak any Japanese. So I spent the first 2 years in full-time language school. But again, always with the mind that we were hoping to do church planting at some point. And I remember early on talking with one of the leaders at the church that we were working with, and I asked them if their church had ever considered the possibility of doing church planting. They were probably the largest church in the prefecture. In my mind, the most likely candidate to be, the mother church of a new church plant. And so I was hopeful that maybe in the future someday we could work with them. But his response at that time was that they felt like they didn't have the resources to do that. And that was kind of disheartening to me because, again, they were the largest church in the area. And if they didn't have the resources to church plant, then none of the other churches had the resources to church plant. But despite that, we kept serving at the church. I did 2 years of language study. After that, I was invited by the pastor to do a 2-year internship. And during the next 2 years, we basically just served at the church with whatever they needed. Again, keeping in mind that we had the goal of doing church planting at some point in the future, but we didn't know how that would work, or who we would wind up partnering with. We just kind of trusted God one step at a time. And yet, as I served at the church for those 2 years, they began to develop the heart for church planting. They felt a need for a new church plant in the city that they had been supporting and sending teams to and doing relief work in. And so by God's grace, it just worked out that after serving there for 2 years, they sent our family down to the coast to be involved in this church plant. And obviously, looking back, we can see that God was working in that the whole time. But I think there's some really practical things that we can take away from that. One is that we built a relationship with the church before having any solid plans to do long-term ministry with them. And that takes a big step of faith. My preference would have been to lay out the roadmap for how we're going to partner together and what we're going to do. But in hindsight, it seems like one of the things that I learned is that when you're working within the Japanese society and particularly the Japanese church community, relationships are very important, and churches are much more comfortable if they know you before they're willing to kind of take that next step into something like church planting in partnership with you. And so it turned out that having those 4 years of just 2 years of just doing language study and attending the church and 2 more years of just serving at the local church really helped us to get to know the leadership and the members of the church. It helped them to get comfortable with us, and it helped them feel like they do maybe have the resources to do church planting now because they've developed a partnership with a missionary. And that was really encouraging for me to see them grow in that area. And I hope that these kinds of relationships can be developed between other missionaries as well, that people can find good Japanese churches to partner with, to build a relationship with, and that relationship will result in partnerships where missionaries can be a meaningful part of what the Japanese church is doing. Now, if missionaries can develop good partnerships with Japanese churches and pastors, there's a lot of ways that we can help serve the Japanese church. There were a number of times where I got the opportunity to preach at our mother church, and it would take me a long time to prepare a sermon in Japanese. But what I generally found was that once I had prepared the sermon, I would get opportunities to preach that same sermon maybe 2 or 3 additional times, either at a church that didn't have a pastor or at a church whose pastor needed, a guest preacher for the week. So there were opportunities like that. And just in general, it seems like Japanese pastors are already doing the work of probably 2 or 3 people. And if missionaries are able to come and help shoulder some of the burden of the workload that they're doing, it can enable them to be more effective in the roles that they're serving in. And this takes a lot of humility, but I think one of the things that we as missionaries need to realize, and probably often do, is that Japanese pastors are a lot more capable of interacting in Japanese than we are. They know the language and the culture naturally. They also tend to be highly educated with seminary degrees. And so if we can find ways to serve and support them and unleash them to be their full potential, that can be a greater impact than us operating at our full potential can be on our own. I get the sense that among the international missions community, we look at this demographic crisis, we look at these dying churches, these churches that only have a few members, that might not have a pastor, and from a practical perspective, almost from a business-like perspective, we tend to look at it and say, well, it's not worth keeping them alive. It's not worth the resources and the effort to support these small congregations and churches. Rather, those resources should be put into church planting and raising up new believers and starting fresh. And again, all of that does need to happen. But one thing that I've really seen working in this rural part of Japan and working with other Japanese pastors is that they have a deep heart for these small congregations. And while it may not make the most sense from a practical standpoint, I think there is something genuinely valuable and really wonderful at that heart of love that they have for these struggling small congregations in places that are in remote areas. Many of these Japanese pastors feel a very strong burden to help these congregations. And we as missionaries, we might sometimes look at this situation and think, well, the Japanese pastors shouldn't be focusing on those small congregations. They need to make that hard decision to go do the more fresh work of raising up new disciples and planting new churches. Again, in many ways, they're a lot more qualified for that work than I would be. But if we really think that one possible way we could help these pastors move in that direction is by getting in the trenches with them and going and helping to share some of the burden in supporting these churches so that they might find time and energy to devote to church planting and leadership development and evangelism and discipleship. And I know historically this has just been such a difficult thing for pastors and missionaries to sort of see eye to eye on, but I really do think that this is a way that we can show a lot of love and support to the Japanese church by serving in this area. The last thing that I think the international Christian community can do to really help address this specific issue is to support Japanese churches and Japanese pastors financially. I hear from many Japanese pastors that are serving congregations that maybe have 10 people or less that are just really struggling to get by. It's very common for pastors to be working a part-time job in addition to their pastoral responsibilities, and yet these Japanese pastors have such a high value on the work that they're doing as pastors that it's very difficult for them to give anything less than 100% of their efforts to serving the church. And so if there are ways that international Christian churches that have more financial resources can come and support Japanese pastors and Japanese churches, I think that can also make a big difference. As I mentioned earlier, our mother church just called a new associate pastor to serve with them. And one of the ways that they were able to afford doing that was that they had some gifts from international churches that gave to help them pay the salary of this new pastor. And that was just a huge blessing to the church. Right now, there doesn't seem to be an easy way for that connection to happen. But if there are international churches out there that have a heart for Japan, I would definitely encourage you to find ways to get connected with Japanese churches. I think churches have done a wonderful job and continue to do a wonderful job in sending missionaries to Japan to work here and to help support the Christians here and to preach the gospel here. That needs to keep happening. We need more missionaries here in Japan. But if there are international churches that are really interested in helping reach Japan, I would definitely encourage you to find ways to also get connected with Japanese churches and find where the needs are and see if there's ways that you can support in that way as well. Pulling all this together, this is a very big challenge in Japan. And again, it's something that is particularly on the minds of Japanese pastors and churches. And I feel like in order to address it, there's a lot that needs to be done both on the side of the Japanese churches and the missions community. And if we can come together and work on this in unity and love, I believe God can bring something wonderful out of this. If you have any questions or anything to add, feel free to drop a comment down below. And if you're not subscribed to our channel, Tomo and I have some more videos that we're working on talking about life and ministry in Japan and Japanese culture. So we'd love it if you'd subscribe to the channel as well. Thank you so much to everybody who has been supporting us and praying for us. God bless, and we'll see you next time.